Hello, it's John McDonnell, and welcome to this TUC Fringe meeting, online Fringe meeting. We're doing it under the auspices of the project we launched a couple of months ago called Claim the Future. We've got a number of speakers, and we're talking about work and how we value work and where do we go from here in ensuring that we have, well, a program of policies which will ensure that workers themselves are protected, have decent jobs, have decent wages, and proper terms of conditions of employment. Dealing with the post-COVID crisis, but also the threat of the recession and how we come out of it. The speakers we've got tonight are Joe Grady, the General Secretary of UCU. We've got Dave Ward from the Communications Workers Union, the General Secretary, and also then Becky Long Bailey, who was the Shadow Secretary of State for Business and then Education as well. Mark Sawaka is going to be along tonight, but he's trapped in other meetings. Apologies for that. But there is a PCS Fringe after this at 6 o'clock. So by all means, go along there to listen to Mark as well. The Claim the Future project was a group of us who came together to talk about the experience of COVID and the pandemic, but also what sort of economy did we need coming out of the crisis itself, but also the sort of economy that we needed to face the existential crisis that we now have to tackle, which is climate change itself. And so the idea was to bring together groups of people who are policy experts, people from think tanks, individual researchers, but with campaigners on the ground around a whole range of issues. And we've been publishing specific papers around, for example, the social care and the care crisis that we face in this pandemic and have done for quite a while. Housing, and we've been working with the Renters Union and ACORN and other policy experts as well about the issues of renters, evictions, and the housing program that we need overall. We've also looked at other issues, and you'll see those papers published over time. One of them that we launched was around the environment, and we're also looking at migration and the issues that we face with regard to public services overall. So go to our website, Claim the Future, and you'll see some of those papers. Today we're publishing a paper on value in work, and that's what this discussion is about this evening. The paper itself, I just briefly take you through it. Basically, it's basically saying this. One of the things that we've discovered during this pandemic and people have woken up to is that actually workers are essential. Whether it's that shop worker, whether it's the driver, getting essential workers to work, whether it's, yes, the care workers and the NHS, but also those tradespeople that we need for the emergency repairs during a crisis like this. But the other thing that's, I suppose, been really brought to mind is, yeah, we need these people, we need these workers, but how we undervalue them within our society. And it's not just me saying that, it's issues around pay. You know, the chief economist at the Bank of England described the last 10 years as a pay disaster. We're seeing people going off sick and not able to sustain themselves on the sick levels of sick pay that Hancock, the Tory Hancock, has admitted he couldn't live on either. And we've seen wage levels, well, before this crisis, well, they were still below the level of average weekly earnings in 2007, 2008, before the banking crash. So the issue for us is, how has that happened? Well, one straightforward answer that we've set out in the paper that came over clear from everyone we talked to really was the assault on trade union rights over decades, the way in which the ability to organize, take industrial action, withdraw one's labor, even represent people has been undermined, and some of those legal rights that we thought were secure were taken away from us. That's the first element of that, of course it is. But in addition to that, what we've also seen is I suppose the way in which there's been a transfer of power from ordinary working people on a scale, well, we've maybe not seen in past generations. We thought there'd be a steady flow whereby workers' rights would be developed and working people would have more power within society. That's been the reverse. And you can see that in the way in which the amount of wealth that has gone to the top 1% as against what's happened with regard to wages themselves. So in the paper, we we've outlined some of the ideas that people have put to us about where we go from here to make sure that as we tackle this crisis, but as we come out of this crisis, well, people's work is properly valued and workers are properly valued themselves and not just have jobs. That's a key element after we've seen the unemployment figures today, but also they have jobs that are decent jobs, are properly paid and are secure. So in the paper, we've set out a number of policy programs that we've picked people's brains, particularly those campaigning at the sharp end. And the first thing that came out, well, almost unanimously, is the work that the Institute of Employment Rights have been doing around sectoral collective bargaining. And what they've done very successfully is describe the way in which sectoral collective bargaining enabled, well, about 80% of us to have pay levels negotiated within the sector that we were working, and so pay levels improved over time, as well as working conditions and terms of employment, and that's things like pensions, holidays, and yes, flexible working in some instances too. But with the decline in sectoral bargaining from 80% of us being covered down to nearly 20%, it's meant actually quite a dramatic shift in power from workers to employers, and as a result of that, an assault on wages and terms and conditions. So one of the key issues we agree with it from our perspective is that actually sectoral collective bargaining restored would make a significant advance for working people in securing decent working conditions, decent pay and proper working protection. The other element that came through is, yes, the restoration of trade union rights. And when we asked people, the experts, but also those on the ground in negotiating situations with employers and others, it was quite clear that we have to scrap the Trade Union Act that was introduced by the Tories in 2016. It's been used to undermine trade unions' rights and abilities to negotiate effectively. Many trade unions, and I pay tribute to this, well, the skill that we have within our movement, have been able to negotiate as best they can, but with one hand tied behind their back. So we do need, yes, to scrap that act, but there's many other restrictions historically laid upon us by successive governments that need to be abolished as well. So that's one area that we feel an urgent step is needed. The third is, of course, about ending insecure work. And it isn't just, as people have told us, about scrapping zero-hour contracts. It's also about having one single status of worker. Yes, respecting that there are some genuine self-employed, but ending bogus self-employment that we have at the moment. And the way in which we can protect people better if we clearly define the definition of worker within legislation to protect them. The other issue that's come up, and the Bakers Union, this Congress have raised the issue of raising the minimum wage. Now, the Labour Party in the general election last December, we argued for a £10 living wage. Times have moved on. The Bakers support them, have argued for a £15 an hour living wage. And our view is that actually, although some businesses may think this is some form of a threat and would undermine their stability in the future, actually it will boost demand within the economy. And when you're going through a pandemic like this, you need that demand back in the economy to ensure we seek to avoid a recession or come out of a recession rapidly. So boosting the minimum wage, I think, would be absolutely critical. The other area, which again has been discussed, but different think tanks about how do we ensure that nobody lives in poverty within our society, the way they are at the moment, is a minimum earnings guarantee. So that actually, if you're not in work, you can actually ensure your earnings are guaranteed. At the moment, too many people, as we've seen from the report yesterday about the expansion of food banks and the threatened hardship and poverty that is now emerging as a result of the people being laid off, as we've seen the worsening of day by day. As a result of that, people are being forced into hardship and poverty, and we've seen real suffering within our society, actually on a scale we never expected to see again. So the idea of having a minimum earnings guarantee is to ensure that actually people do have the basic income to ensure that they survive and that they have a reasonable living. And there's been different views expressed about the levels. The TUC have argued, for example, that universal credit should be at a level of £260 a week. The Joseph Rowntree Foundation have defined what is needed as a minimum earning level just to get by, about £221 a week, and others have adopted that as a figure. We believe the whole concept of a minimum earnings guarantee is one that should be adopted now. And I think it's just rational, sound, common sense. Finally, in the discussions that we've been having is, of course, all these proposals, all these elements of this policy program would certainly protect people, their incomes, it would protect them in work, and it would protect them out of work. But actually, we need the work. So that's why we've also been publishing a paper around the green economy that we need for the future. We now, hopefully, in this coming period, we'll be able to tackle the crisis of this pandemic, but we face the existential crisis of climate change. And that has to be our priority. So to tackle that, we need to build a sustainable economy, a green economy. It's the work that Becky Long-Bailey was doing around the green industrial revolution. And that needs, we believe, well, a massive intervention in the economy at scale, fast and long-term planned as well. Our argument is that you need something like after the Second World War, the Marshall Aid Plan that took place, that the Attlee government used to, well, take us into a peace in which they provided the basic welfare state that we helped us throughout our lives, but is now being whittled away by this Tory government. But it would be a green investment programme with a national investment bank, a Ministry of Works, making sure that we undertook the massive insulation programme that we need of our homes, our public buildings, and our offices and factories, but also the conversion to a fuel supply for our industries that was not dependent on fossil fuel, and also our transport infrastructure in the same way, but also that we then built the alternative energy sources that we so need in terms of solar, wind, and wave. All of that will provide us with the jobs that we need for the future. It will save our planet, but those jobs have to be protected by a program of basic trade union rights, the ability to ensure that people are properly represented and that they have power at work. Have a look at our website, Claim the Future, and you'll see that paper. And by all means, let us have your comments on that as we go forward. There'll be other papers that we publish on different topics, and we'll be holding Zoom and meetings like this to engage with more and more people as we build up this alternative program. But it's not just about discussing it, it's about campaigning for it as well, and supporting those people and those campaigns that are campaigning, not just to protect themselves, but to develop a new future, the new society, a new economy that we now need. I'd like now to pass on to our next speaker, which is Joe Grady. Joe is the General Secretary of the UCU, as I've said, and actually recent in the job, as people know, but having a real effect. And I've been on picket lines and in meetings with her members, who she's mobilized effectively to win argument after argument in support of not just her members' jobs, but also education for our youngsters too. Joe.
Thank you, John. Hello to everyone, and it's lovely that these TUC Fringe events are happening, even though we're not all together. I just wanted to start by paying tribute, really, before I sort of get into the content of this Fringe, to thousands of UCU members and the hundreds of staff that have really worked tirelessly throughout this pandemic. Politicians keep referring to, universities, colleges and schools as having been closed, but education never stopped. The activities associated with education have never stopped. Students have been taught throughout lockdown, research has continued, libraries have continued to provide people with resources. And much like John was saying, people have worked really hard to protect each other. And I think it's really important to pay tribute to those people. At the beginning of lockdown, from UCU's perspective, that meant demanding immediate health and safety for our members that educate people in prisons, alongside protecting jobs for precariously employed people and I'll come back to that because I think it aligns really well with the report, and getting that furlough scheme extended and really pushing employers to top up that 80% to 100% with regards salary. One of the things that, if you've been watching the news recently or looking at UCU's campaigning, is you will know that we have taken a very strong position on the return to in-person teaching in post-16 education. At the moment, in Scotland, universities have gone back. In England, Wales and Northern Ireland, colleges have, and universities are due to go back. And we see millions of students and hundreds of thousands of staff in adult, further and higher education who are being pushed to return to in-person teaching. And this is despite the fact that even the government's own scientific advisory group for emergencies is telling us to get ready for outbreaks. And one of the connections that we need to make is the economic model and the way in which education is funded, and how that connects to the broader points of this report, and how human health and safety is being put second to the need to create revenue and profit in those education and other sectors. So the SAGE group and us and Independent SAGE have been warning that the return to in-person teaching and working more broadly could cause a second wave at the very worst time. But what we've also been saying, and I think this is where it actually complements the message of this report, is a second wave is preventable. Continuing on in the system that we have is preventable. We do not have to keep living out the awful future that is ahead of us. There are options, there are alternatives. And we are, in particular in this instance, are calling for as much work to be done remotely as possible, to make our workplaces safe for anyone who has to be there, and avoid chaos for students when things move online. But, and I think this is where I want to draw some parallels here, we, trade unions, in this moment, are the ones calling for caution. The government and sector leaders at both college and particularly university level are ploughing ahead. They're ploughing ahead at university level because they've constructed a market, and this market needs its ultimate consumer, who are students, to pay fees and rent. And then the knock on to all of the other revenue generating activities associated with education. Now, the point that we are making is, and I think this speaks to what John was just saying, if we had a different funding regime for our education sector, nobody would be being asked right now to put their personal health and safety at risk in order that those revenue generating activities can continue. And that is a really sort of simple but fundamental critique to make of the system that's happening right now. Unions are organising and have been throughout the pandemic to keep workplaces safe, to provide education and awareness to the wider population to keep them safe. And we're being really clear and realistic about where our power as a union comes from. And what I want to sort of talk about and link it back really to this report is very much to use the pandemic. Arundhati Roy recently said that we should look at the pandemic as a portal, and actually what would we like the society that we live in and the economy that governs that to look like after that time. And I think as a result, this project and this report is really, really timely for everybody to be saying, what do you want when we come out of the portal? And the complete abdication that we have of leadership in Westminster right now means that we have to fill that vacuum where there is no leadership or message. And actually, I think throughout lockdown, before then, but particularly, trade unions have been doing that. We saw that with the NEU, with schools. We are seeing this now with UCU, with colleges and universities. We've seen it with numerous other trade unions that have had to step in and really make the case for keeping people safe when the government won't. And I just want to talk briefly a little bit about how we can do that and sort of the campaigning and organising, if you like, that is essential to bring people with you, to counteract the notion that asking for these things, demanding them and getting them is kind of pie in the sky, because it's not. And I think that if the pandemic has taught us anything, it's that, survival should not be our main aim. Getting the bare minimum from an incompetent government should not be our main aim. When UCU stood shoulder to shoulder with the NUS over the A-levels and campaigned unapologetically about injustice with really clear demands, the government U-turned. And we have to kind of adopt that boldness, but also ownership of what a blueprint of our future looks like. And I think if there's a criticism to be leveled sometimes at the left or the trade union movement more broadly, is that there's not always a really strong articulation of what we want in our future, how we will build back better, how that aligns to a Green New Deal, how actually greening our institutions from the production lines that provide our food in our canteens, to divesting from fossil fuels in our pension schemes, how that benefits everybody. Conversations about migrant justice, all of these things are relying on us doing them and actually articulating and really taking on those dominant arguments that are so dominant, that they shape the way we're even able to conceptualize the world, and then hinder the way in which we imagine our potential futures could be. And I don't personally think, and I'm pretty sure I've heard Dave Ward say this before as well, but I don't think there are any better vehicles than trade unions to do that. Yes, trade unions are about enabling and giving workers confidence and helping workers organize within their workplaces to protect themselves. Workers protect themselves. Unions don't necessarily do it. But they're also moments for educating workers and also educating the people who come into contact with you as workers. So in UCU in this past year, we've had numerous disputes both at further education and higher education. If you've seen any reporting of our disputes in the press, you will have noticed that we have been really supported. We've been generally really supported by our students. We've been generally really supported by local communities in colleges, in college city and towns, and in university city and towns. So in Nottingham College took extended strike action. They took 15 days. Students were on picket lines with their staff. The whole city got behind the college because the UCU branch there was really good and supported nationally by us at articulating what was so unjust about what the college was trying to do. They made a really strong and unapologetic defense of education. And actually the college ended up caving to their every demand. The same sort of spirit of bringing the constituency that, potentially would normally be weaponized against you has been seen at higher education level as well. UCU is involved in some significant strike action at higher education level this year, very much actually on conditions that align with some of this report's key focus. So insecure employment, stagnating and seriously declining pay, the ability to therefore kind of protect yourself within that, spiraling workloads, which as we know is a problem across many different sectors, and also equality pay gaps. One of the things that we saw time and time again on UCU picket lines was the ability to connect with students, the ability to connect with other colleagues, the ability to connect with people who were maybe walking past your picket line on their way to their job, to sort of say, well, why are you here? What are you doing? What are you fighting for? And to really kind of tell the story about your sector that, particularly I think in education and particularly higher education, people think it's a kind of a gold-plated sector. I remember my first TUC, which was last year, and I remember telling other general secretaries about the extent of insecure work in higher education. I think I actually remember telling you, Dave, and I feel like people had to pick their chins up off the floor when I said about how bad casualisation was in higher education compared to other sectors, a prestigious sector that it takes so much training to to get into. And I think the problem sometimes, and I do think sometimes the response to this pandemic has epitomized this, that we've internalized that it has to be this way, that it can't be any other way than this. But, you know, whether it's unions and employment models, we do not have to accept that. And it's exactly the same with our economy. And I think it's really interesting that John drew the parallel with that post-World War era, because one of the really interesting things about that post-Second World War era was just how bold some of the things that happened there were, but also actually the coalition of people who wanted a change. And we often talk about the Beveridge Report and Keynesianism as being, you know, the kind of bedrock of social democracy. And I'm not here to kind of plug the sort of liberals, but, you know, Beveridge was a liberal. Keynes had a very particular type of grasp on economics and politics. We, as a labour movement in that post-1945 era, essentially cherry-picked things that we liked from the report of a liberal. We didn't necessarily do what I think John is trying to do here and now, which is fully articulate our own set of demands and expectations of an economy that is unapologetically owned by a labour kind of political ideology and a trade union movement. That didn't happen in 1945. And I think it's one of the reasons it was relatively not easy, but was unravelled when the kind of neoliberal assault in the 1970s really took hold. So I just think it's really important to pick up on that, because we, at the moment, I think in this movement, have everything we need to educate each other, to organise people, to put forward powerful arguments about the alternative that we need and deserve. But we have to unapologetically earn it. And we also have to acknowledge that there's no shortcuts to this. The deal that the Beveridge Report kind of ended up propelling into public consciousness that we saw post-1945 was the product of a lot of work. The unpicking of it from 1970s onwards in a neoliberal manner was a lot of work. We have a lot of work ahead of us now. And some of that will be achieved by making trade union laws less restrictive. I undoubtedly wouldn't argue that. But actually, a lot of it is going to be achieved by hard work, by trade unions, by other community groups on the ground who, you know, at the minute we're seeing this 50% threshold and saying, well, we wish it wasn't here, but it's a floor, not a ceiling. Because if you want maximum leverage in your workplace, in your communities, you need everybody participating to get the things that we all deserve. I think it's possible. But I think we really need to rediscover and re-engage what on the ground organising is. And as I say, really kind of unapologetically own our own vision of our future and make strong, clear and positive claims to what we all deserve, and in an inclusive way. Thanks, John.
Joe, thanks ever so much. I know you've got to slip off to another meeting. I'm grateful for that. Okay, really grateful. I suppose you've summed up the whole nature of the discussion that we've been having as a project. We call ourselves Claim the Future as a result of discussions about, look, we can't sit back and just let things happen. We've got to claim it, and it's got to be our future as well. That's the whole point. Definitely. Thanks, Joe. That was really helpful, really interesting. Cheers. Our next speaker is Dave Ward, the General Secretary of CWU. All of you will know Dave for the work that he's done over the years, but also the way in which CWU has been at the leading edge of a lot of the debates and discussions about new policy programs, new initiatives, what the new trade union movement should look like, but also what a Labour government should look like as well, and where we should be going now in terms of radical progressive policies. Over to you, Dave.
Yeah, thanks, John, and hi everybody. It's really pleasing to follow somebody like Joe Grady, you know, one of the new generation of trade union leaders, along with people like Sarah Woolley of the Bakers Union. It gives me a lot of inspiration, to be honest with you, that things are starting to move forward and our movement is getting stronger. It's also very pleasing tonight to share a platform again with Becky Long-Bailey, somebody who I think is one of the few MPs who truly understands what representing working class people means. Look, the CWU fully support the Claim the Future project that John has initiated, because we, like we supported John and Jeremy when they were leaders of the Labour Party, we know that we need bold transformational change in this country. We need the sort of policies that will absolutely shift the balance of forces in the world of work and tackle the deep-rooted social and economic inequality that hasn't just come about as a result of this pandemic. It's been decades in the making. Now, look, one positive that I think we can take from the pandemic as we grapple what is a dreadful ongoing public health crisis is that we can be positive, that we have definitely changed the mindset of the nation on who key workers really are. And I think what John's project is challenging us to do now is to move that debate forward to the nitty-gritty about how we're going to make sure that key workers are properly rewarded, how we're going to force government and employers to revalue the whole world of work. And, you know, there's a couple of startling facts that we need to keep in mind here. One is that when you think about care workers and how much more over the years we're going to, because of the demographics of the population, that we're going to rely on a strong care sector. 50% of care workers today earn less than the living wage. The TUC has put forward research that shows that an estimated 80% of all key workers earn less than the living wage. In our own sector, let me give an example of a sector where a trade union has fought strongly over many, many years for good unionised jobs, where we set the high benchmark in the post and logistics sector on earnings. But what we've seen is an explosion of bogus self-employment as competition takes a grip within the sector. And I'm not just talking about jobs and contracts where people don't get sick pay. I'm talking about in the parcels sector, some of these new companies that have come into the market, they actually fine people if they don't find a replacement when they're out on genuine sick leave. So, you know, this shows you how big a problem that we face. In BT at the moment, our members in BT, I think people know that postal workers have worked throughout this crisis. We're classified as key workers, but our members in British Telecom were also classified as key workers. They've worked throughout this crisis, and the employers, you know, has heaped praise on them for keeping the country connected. But at the same time, it's chosen to introduce some of the first compulsory redundancies we've seen since the company was privatised in 1984. One of the points I want to make tonight is that, of course, we need to hold the government to account. We know that this government represents one of the most dangerous set of politicians that are going to seek to divide our country, our people, and we've got to fight against them. But we also need to turn the heat up on employers, because I'm fed up with employers who make the headlines, who are seen as all these great business leaders, when I've got to say that most of the ones that I've met can never bring anything to the table other than, well, this is how you cut jobs, this is how you cut pay, this is how you cut services. So society needs to demand more from today's business leaders. So look, Claim the Future is an absolutely vital project, because I think we face the reality of the biggest jobs and economic crisis that we will have seen in our lifetime. And I say that not just because of COVID, but because pre-COVID, the UK economy was already founded on insecure work, in-work poverty and austerity. The entrenched inequality that we've seen has been decades in the making, and decades of attacks on trade unions has helped bring that about. I also say it because I want to remind people that we're also on the cusp of the fourth industrial revolution. This is going to pose further threats to jobs. There will be some opportunities as well. But unless we take a grip, unless we claim the future, unless we start talking about these massive issues, we ain't going to be in the right place here to protect working people. And I also say it because we also know what needs to change in the way the economy works in order to save the planet. All of these things are colliding at the same time. So this is where we are. I think we know what the issues are. I think we know that with people like John bringing forward very bold policies, we know the policies that we need to pursue. But what's missing for me at the moment is that we haven't yet worked out the strategy to deliver the change that we need. And this is why at the TUC today, I said that the biggest challenge facing the trade union movement in winning for working people is that we have to now mobilise working people. And the CWU, in our motions to this year's TUC Congress, have really put forward 3 additional things that we could do that would bring that about. Firstly, we're asking and calling for all trade union leaders to sit down in the same room and work out a strategy to mobilise our members and workers across the UK to make the world of work the #1 political issue, and to cut through with a campaign in the same way that we can take inspiration from what Black Lives Matter has achieved. Secondly, all unions. We want to see all unions get behind the overarching narrative. We understand that unions will face their particular issues. We're all under pressure, but we need an overarching narrative, and we believe that is to fight for a new deal for working people. And as part of that, we're calling for trade union leaders in the UK to sit in that room again and agree a shared set of industrial and political demands, much of what could be included is in John's project. So, that's our second aim, is to get those shared demands agreed and then get workers mobilising behind those demands. And thirdly, something that we can do immediately, and the CWU will do in the next few weeks, is we don't have to wait for legislation to introduce sectoral collective bargaining, a key ingredient of changing people's lives. We can do it now. And we are setting out a vision where we want to see unions within certain sectors working together, cooperating to organise workers, but also to agree common bargaining agendas. Imagine how powerful it would be if we had unions signed up to in specific sectors like care, where we were saying, all the different unions were saying, so we're going to agree a bargaining agenda that deals with safety standards, that deals with pay, that deals with working time, that deals with how we use technology. And also that we can use it to take forward our social role, where we can tackle institutionalised racism within a sector of the economy, where we can address the gender pay gap. These are issues that should be part of a common bargaining agenda, and the CWU is going to approach unions in the next few weeks to join us in starting that process within the postal and logistics sector. So look, my message is very simple. This is a moment where I think more than anything, the trade union movement has the power, has the influence. If we act together, we can definitely change what's going on, and we can change what the future will look like. So together, it's time for us to lead that fight, and we can bring forward a new democratic economy based on our values, our principles of equality, of universalism, and of collectivism. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Dave. You've made dynamic the discussions that we've been having in individual policy areas to actually be able to, you've made them dynamic by way of, I think, finding a way in which you can move them forward in those discussions and debates. I hope the other trade union leaders, the other trade union representatives come behind you on that. And it's been needed for quite a while. We know that, but I think the combination of the, as you say, the economy before the pandemic was scraping along the bottom, wages held back and business investment not taking place. But the pandemic has focused people's minds, and we're now on the edge, as you say, of a recession on a scale we've not seen since the 1930s if we're not careful. So maybe I'm just hoping that they take your lead and that gives people a sense of urgency and commitment now, because I think people can be mobilized. I really do. And all the conversations and discussions I've been having. And as you say, there's so many examples now of people mobilizing. Black Lives Matter, you mentioned, but also look at what's been happening in terms of the renters and others. The campaigns are waged right the way across the country. Thanks for that, Dave. That's incredibly inspiring. Our final speaker is Becky Long Bailey. Becky was Shadow Secretary of State for BEIS, and then before that, I'll just mention it, she was also in my Treasury team as the Chief Secretary as well. Did a brilliant job. But then went on to BEIS and developed, I think, some of the earliest and fundamental thinking about how we go forward on a green industrial revolution, a green new deal, etc. And I just think it was inspiring then, and it's laid the foundations for some of the discussions on policy that we're now having. Over to you, Becky.
Thanks so much, John, and thanks for organising this event yourself and Claim the Future, because it's never been so important. And I think everything in the paper that you've set out needs to happen urgently. I agree with everything that John, yourself, Joe and Dave have said so far. And looking at where we are at the moment, during the lockdown, we saw how important our essential workers were. From bus drivers to postal workers to health workers to lorry drivers, you name it. They went to work every day and put their lives at risk with little to no protection in many cases. We had health workers fighting for the basic PPE at the start of the pandemic, if you remember. And for those non-essential workers, like many people right across Salford, they were still asked to go to work before the era of so-called COVID-secure workplaces that we supposedly have now. But many were working in warehouses and other sites where social distancing was nigh on impossible, and very few dared to speak out for fear of losing their jobs. And then we saw the easing of the lockdown, and we were told it was to get the economy moving. Apparently, we had to balance the need to protect public health against the health of the economy. And we started with the schools debacle. There was no real plan. The guidance originally, all those months ago, was changed over 41 times. And we saw the demonisation of those trade unions in the education sector for having the audacity to raise valid safety concerns and ask the government to work with them in developing robust safety measures to protect pupils and staff, and to also have a plan in place to deal with outbreaks, to have blended home and school learning so that pupils actually got the education they needed, whether they were able to go into school or not. And sadly, those safety concerns were valid, as we know today, a few weeks into the new term, where we see numerous schools having to close down because many of the pupils have tested positive or they can't even get access to a test. And then we saw the government allow people who couldn't work from home to go back to work, and they were told initially to just have a reasonable chat with your boss about safety measures. But with the funding of the Health and Safety Executive cut to the bone over the last 10 years, few workplaces could ever expect a visit from a HSE representative to make sure that everything was actually okay and that they were safe workplaces. And there's not many employees that would really risk their job by speaking out, particularly if they were in a workplace that wasn't trade union represented. And then there were those who couldn't go to work, who weren't supported, those who didn't have the right to sick pay. Over 3 million people, from musicians to freelancers, to new starters, to businesses who couldn't access support. And if they could access some, it was very little. And many were told to take out business support loans, if you remember. But many of those small businesses and self-employed people, they couldn't afford to pay the repayments on those business loans. So today they struggle, haven't had any support, they're struggling to pay their rent and their mortgages, and they're worrying themselves sick about what's going to happen next. And now the government's master plan, as infection rates are rising exponentially now, the R rate is above 1 in most, if not all, areas of the UK. And the government tells us that we've got to get back to work, even if you can legitimately work from home. And the world-beating test, track and trace system that all of this relied upon, well, it's an absolute shambles. And I've been inundated with messages over the last week or so from people all over Salford who can't access a test. And if they can, they've been asked to go to Inverness, Llandudno, Birkenhead. It's absolutely unacceptable. And just remember, months ago, when the government talked about easing the lockdown, and Lord knows we were all desperate for it to be eased because we wanted some semblance of normality, but they told us that schools and workplaces would only be open when the R rate was below 1, but it's now above 1. They were advised by scientists that getting the economy moving was reliant on a widespread functioning test, track, trace and isolate system, but that isn't functioning. But at the back of all this, I don't blame people for thinking that they have to make a choice between either beating the virus or going to work every day to keep their jobs, because many do feel forced to choose between their health and their livelihood. The government is going to remove the furlough scheme next month, and it's ending its ban on evictions. And for those who do get sick pay, as we know, statutory sick pay is £95.85 a week, which is below what other leading industrial nations pay as sick pay. And that's if you're a worker that's even lucky enough to get sick pay. Many don't, many on 0-hour contracts and other gig workers don't have access to statutory sick pay at all. So you see, we were already in a crisis before this pandemic hit. We weren't setting people up to be financially secure to be able to deal with what was to come. Workers' rights and financial security had already been eroded, starting as far back as 1979, and decades of deindustrialisation. They'd left whole regions economically fragile, and they hadn't even bounced back from the financial crash in 2007, 2008. And most people are only one paycheck away from financial devastation. So with the prospect of mass job losses on the horizon, some inevitable due to the lack of support that businesses have got, and some deliberately manufactured, frankly, by unscrupulous employers, we've got the makings here of the worst financial crisis we've ever seen. But we were also facing another crisis before this hit, as some of the speakers have already said, the climate crisis. And it's very interesting to me to look, from the sidelines at what's happening now, and to note that the arguments around climate change were actually very similar to the arguments that are being used now in how we respond to this pandemic. How we were told in both cases that it's a juggling act between protecting public health and protecting jobs and the economy. But frankly, it's not an argument that we should ever have to make. Protecting lives and protecting incomes should never be a trade-off. They should go hand in hand. And it's our job now to set out exactly what needs to be done to ensure that this can happen. So firstly, John's paper is spot on. The rights of workers have got to be strengthened. And that means introducing sectoral collective bargaining. It means restoring and expanding trade union rights. It means creating a single status of worker, boosting the minimum wage, reducing working hours where it's possible, and establishing a minimum income guarantee so everybody has a basic standard of living. Secondly, the safety net that people need to protect themselves during this pandemic, it's got to be provided without equivocation. And that means extending the furlough scheme, it means banning evictions, and it means ensuring the 3 million who've been excluded from government support so far are included. It also means decent sick pay. in line with other leading nations, and it means the right to work from home where this is possible, and if it's not possible, stringent health and safety measures where it isn't possible. And it also means a properly resourced test, track, trace and isolate regime with fast results. And yes, I also think that we should be looking at supporting sectors and businesses to protect jobs, and we should be doing it in return for conditions like good treatment and pay of workers, trade union access, carbon reduction, and even public equity stakes in large businesses who receive bailouts. And then the third point, and this is the million-dollar question that we're always asked, and certainly John and myself are sick of being asked these sorts of questions whenever we went up for a media interview. It's how do we actually pay for this? Well, we're going to need the biggest industrial plan this country has ever seen, from sector-specific plans to public infrastructure projects to keep the economy going as we do recover and to deal with any potential job losses that may come further down the line. From renewables to medicines to manufacturing, we've got the opportunity to invest and to lead the world, and that will require detailed local industrial strategies and education guarantees to match these strategies. And to follow on from a point that Joe made earlier, we've got to take the market out of education, because it's not just there to enrich us. It's not a luxury. Education is actually there to serve our industrial strategy. We've got to make sure that we are providing those businesses and those organisations with the workers who have the skills to carry out the tasks that they need them to. So education is a fundamental part of our economic recovery. The other element of it is looking at the specific sector support and the types of strategies that we need to roll out. And one element, as I think every speaker's mentioned so far, is a green industrial revolution, a Green New Deal, if you like. And we carried out a report on this before the general election. We had a team of industrial experts and engineers working on plans just in relation to the energy sector to start off with, to show how we could decarbonise the economy and create jobs as a result. And the plan that we set out identified the most radical feasible pathway to decarbonise our energy system by 2030. And it was a catalyst for manufacturing, for rebuilding deindustrialised towns across the UK. And at its heart was a plan to restructure and rebalance the economy as we know it, using elements of public ownership to drive the change that we needed to see and to redistribute essentially the prosperity that it created to those who needed it and deserved it. So one example of that I'll give, because I won't spend half the night talking about this, but one example I'll give is where we talked about taking a majority public stake in new wind farms. And that would mean that even if we only took a 51% stake and then, private investor took 49%, as a majority shareholder, we'd have the power to try and make sure that we've procured the steel, the bits and bobs that went into that wind farm. I'm not a scientist or a technical expert, by the way, so I can't talk about the specific components, but we could ensure that those components were built using UK-based supply chains to support industries and regions here. We could make sure that across those industries, there was a condition on decent terms and conditions and trade union representation. And we could also ensure that when these wind farms were up and running, the prosperity and the income that they generated, it actually went back into those communities, either by investing in their own public realm or infrastructure, or actually be used just to bring people's energy bills down. It was using the weight of public investment to drive that economic change and change economic culture in the way that it needs to. But what we also found when we carried out this piece of work, just in relation to energy, I have to say, is that by just investing 1.9% of GDP each year on energy alone, you'd have provided a net benefit of £800 billion across the UK by 2030. And that would have generated 850,000 new jobs across the green energy sector. And it was also argued that due to increased economic prosperity, wages could also increase by 2% across the economy. And it's not just left-wing or supposed left-wing economic thinkers that can generate this kind of economic excitement. The likes of Goldman Sachs have talked about the investment potential in renewables. I think they estimated that $16 trillion could be generated worldwide if we really grasp the nettle on this and started to drive the change at a rapid rate. And Lord knows it needs to be driven at a rapid rate, because if we don't decarbonise the economy, we're not going to be able to claim our future, quite frankly, because we won't have one. So, in conclusion, we do face one of the biggest economic and health crises we've ever seen. But if we don't use this moment to instigate economic change on a massive scale, it's not just going to be our recovery from the pandemic or tackling climate change that's going to be in peril here. It'll be any shred of trust that we're trying to build in our communities, that we as a movement actually have the answers to the real problems they face. So thank you very much for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks, Becky. That was terrific. Thanks ever so much. You've set a hell of an agenda. That's really great. Thanks a lot. Look, we're coming to the end. We're quite time limited, but there was a question that I think I've just seen on the list that was put up by Charlie Mansell. Thanks. And basically, if you can see the question, 6 policy interventions on the Claim the Future website. Look, a very strong policy agenda. Well, they are, Charlie. You're right. And so Charlie was asking how some of the ways in which we can promote them, and he's given some examples there: private members legislation, etc. In the last couple of minutes, let me just explain that one of the best ways, I think, of promoting these ideas is exactly what Dave is doing, which is bringing trade union general secretaries and others together to create a real agenda for the future now. But before we close, let me just give this plug as well. I've secured, Charlie gave one of the examples as private members legislation. One of the mechanisms we can use is also just getting it on the floor of the House of Commons. And one of the ways of doing that is a 10-minute rule bill. So we've got a 10-minute rule bill coming up on 30th of September. And basically what it does, it sets a standard for British businesses. And it's something Becky and I have discussed this before in the past. So basically it's saying that British businesses should be almost kite marked, given accreditation on whether or not, first of all, on trade union rights, they recognise a trade union. They don't employ people on 0-hour contracts. They pay a real living wage. The second is around making sure that, for example, as Becky has said, that they abide by basic environmental standards and contribute towards tackling climate change. And the third is that they pay their taxes. And one of the ideas is let's have not just HMRC, but let's have the tax justice campaign assess companies on whether they're paying their taxes as they properly should. And the idea is to basically introduce a piece of legislation that enables us to debate those issues, but also says, well, if a company wants access to support from the government, state aid in some form, as in furloughs or other ways, or tax relief or whatever, well, they should only get that support if they abide by these basic standards of good business practice. If they want to be listed on the London stock market, exactly the same. In fact, in some stock markets, that's exactly what's happening. Companies are required to abide by certain standards. So in that way, Charlie, that's one of the ways in which, well, as you said in your question, we could promote individual elements of this agenda. You also asked about what would be the priorities. Can I just give one priority, which I think is important? It's the point that Dave made. Let's get sectoral collective bargaining off the ground and let's not wait for it. And I tell you, in one area where it's needed is the care sector, where there's really low pay and where people are exploited, they're not respected. And actually, I don't know what it's like in other constituencies, but in my constituency, where lives have been put at risk because of lack of protection and lack of testing so far. If we got sectoral collective bargaining installed in the care sector, we'd transform it. Becky, just want to comment on the question itself about how we go forward.
I think it's about now, if we're using Parliament as a vehicle, yes, to make sure that we get EDMs and we try and get debates on this, but it's about bringing together the movement and trying to use specific elements of this campaign and different demands to bring together people who wouldn't ordinarily have been in our tent, if you like. So it's about trying to get the care worker who isn't a member of a trade union to become, interested in this. It's about making sure that within our communities we have local campaigns and tie it to the everyday experiences that people are facing. And it's going to be really hard for our communities. There's never been a more appropriate time, in my view, to talk to people about their rights and security at work, because people are more insecure now than they ever have been. So we've all got a story to tell through our Facebook pages, through our Twitter, through our local media, and make sure that that's fed up to our local politicians. And if you don't have a politician who's talking about these things, you need to be mobilising them. And in my experience, the MP who takes action on something is usually somebody who's been battered by about 150 to 200 emails on a subject, and they think to themselves, I better say something about this, otherwise I'll never hear the end of it. So we need to make sure we're mobilising people to do that.
Basic lesson in democracy. Dave, you're doing this anyway. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's very simple, John and Charlie, who I know. Good to see you, Charlie, or hear you. And for me, it is about making sure that we sit in a room as trade union leaders, and we agree a mobilisation strategy for workers. As part of that, you have to agree shared industrial and political demands that are overarching, that everybody can relate to. You publicise those and you mobilise people within unions around those. And finally, for me, I think it's about starting with action. So, we're serious about what I said about starting to move forward with a common bargain agenda. We're going to contact all of the unions that represent workers in the post and logistics sector. And we want to sit down with those unions and draw up all of the issues that we should all be campaigning around. And, the contractual status of employees is obviously a massive one. And like John said, it's not just about 0-hour contracts. That's hugely important that we oppose that. But it's about all of these contracts that are short-term, no holiday pay, no sick pay, specific event contracts. So for me, the trade union movement has to now move forward on what actions we're going to take. And I don't think it's as complicated as what we might think. So that's the commitment we're making to bring about change.
Thanks, Dave. My parting words really are these, is that in the most difficult of circumstances, faced with possibly the most challenging threats of both economic, social, and environmental that any generation has faced, I actually think there's a determination out there now for change. And I actually think there's a determination for radical change, pragmatic radical change. And that's what we're about. And I think we're winning. I think we're winning the ideas. Now it's about winning on the ground. And exactly as Dave and Becky have said, and Joe earlier, it's about mobilization. And I think we all have a responsibility on our shoulders to undertake, to fulfill our roles in that mobilization. And well, when we call for support, when we urge for support, we'll know that it's there in solidarity. Anyway, thanks. I'd like to thank all the speakers this evening, Dave and Becky and Joe. And I'd like to thank everyone who's attended as well online. And we'll be publishing other papers, and there'll be other online meetings as well as we go through this coming period. That'll be convened by Claim the Future. But go to the website, read the papers, and then let us have your ideas. Okay. Thanks a lot. Good evening.